OSEP. My apologies. I'm a bit under the weather, so I think that may be part of it. The purpose of today's call is to inform the parent centers about our differentiating monitoring and support that's being done from the Office of Special Education Programs for the states. And we want to inform you about what's happening this year so that when you engage with your states around anything having to do with the state's systemic improvement plan or any of the work that's going in the states in order to improve services for students with disabilities, you're aware of what's going on in terms of the differentiated monitoring. As you know, different monitoring in the states for their compliance with special education and early intervention happens on the monitoring and state improvement planning team, which is the other half of the Office of Special Education Programs. So our presenter today is going to be Matt Schneer, a colleague of ours in the Monitoring and State Improvement Planning Division, and he's going to talk about the differentiated monitoring. Before we get to that, I have a couple of small announcements to make, most of which are, of course, public. One, we being OSEP, are looking for comments as to plans to possibly delay the implementation of the new regulations around significant disproportionality and possibly having them delayed for 2 years until not being implemented into 2020. I sent out information with a link to the Federal Register to all the regional parent technical assistance centers, and I'm sure they've passed it on to you. And so therefore, you're probably have gotten that link to the Federal Register. I strongly encourage you to go to the Federal Register and follow the procedures for making comments and letting people know how you feel about the possibility of having those regulations delayed. Secondly, we are going to start the process for collecting the performance measure data from your service descriptions in the end of January, early February. We will have a webinar around that time in order to explain the results from last year, which were very, very good, and then also explain the process for this coming year. We have a new contractor. It's no longer going to be the study group, but rather WestStat is going to be involved in the collection of the program performance measures, and with it will come some possible changes to you. So I strongly encourage you to be on that webinar also. The other thing I wanted to announce is in the chat space, I put in a link to the captioning that's going on right now. So please follow the link in order to get the captions if you need captioning for this webinar. Okay. Okay. We're going to start this webinar with a very brief poll about your knowledge about differentiated monitoring. So, Elena, if you could show up the poll. So here you have the polling questions. How familiar are you with the differentiated monitoring systems levels of engagement for this year or last year? So if you could answer the poll, this will give Matt a sense of how we might answer that. You might. Okay. So let's leave it open a little longer. Okay. If it looks like we have quite a few respondents, Elena, can you close the poll and we can look at the results? Okay. So 64%, which is over half of you, are not familiar with your differentiated monitoring system levels of engagement for this year or last year, and 36% of you are aware of it. So this is good information as before Matt starts the presentation. One other note I want to make is that if you look on your pod on the side, you'll see a place called Handouts, and it has 3. You can click on that and you can download PDFs of this presentation and 2 handouts that Matt will then discuss during the course of his presentation. So feel free to do that and download it. before you leave the webinar. I'm really sorry. I have quite the cold, so it's difficult to talk. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt, and I will be monitoring the question pod and then responding, asking Matt the questions, mostly at the end of the presentation. So feel free to type in your questions as they occur to you, and we'll have Matt address them at the end of his presentation. So with that, let me turn it over to Matt Schneer. Thanks.
Thank you, Carmen. As Carmen said, my name is Matt Schneer. I'm an Associate Division Director in the Monitoring State Improvement Programs Division of OSEP, and I've worked with Carmen for quite some time. I'm really pleased to be able to have the opportunity to talk to you today. I come to this work in special education really due to the birth of my daughter almost be 19 years ago on January 1st, New Year's Day. My daughter Sylvie was born with severe disabilities, which kind of was a shock to us, but it's been quite a journey, and I became more and more interested in the field and wanting to make a difference, and that's how I ended up where I am today. So I know I really honor the work that you do with parents out there, trying to provide them the best information that you can and keep them involved and all of those good things. So I'm really happy to be able to move on. Can we, Elena, can we move into the PowerPoint? Great. So what you're seeing there is the agenda for today. We're going to talk very briefly in the beginning about RDA and what DMS is and how it fits into that, and then talk more about how differentiated monitoring and support, DMS, is being implemented and the changes we made this year and what we anticipate for the future, and just give you some things to think about that you might want to ask your states about if it seems appropriate to you. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so RDA, or Results-Driven Accountability, and my guess is that almost all of you, if not all of you, know what this is, but stretching back several years now, back to 2012, our former director of OSEP announced that we were making a shift in how we did accountability in our work and moving into something called Results-Driven Accountability, or RDA. And the essence of it is to try to provide a greater balance from a system focused primarily on compliance to one that puts a greater emphasis on results. That does not mean that we don't care about compliance. We certainly do. We recognize how important it is, but we also want to make sure that we're paying attention to outcomes for kids with disabilities. And because everything is compliant does not necessarily mean that kids are having the results that we would like to see. So the essence of RDA is trying to maintain concern with compliance while continuing to try to partner with states to see how we can lift up the assessment scores, the graduation rates, reduce the dropout rates, all of those kinds of things that we want for all of our kids, including specifically here, kids with disabilities. Next slide, please. Okay, so RDA, we like to say, has three pillars to it. One are the annual determinations that we make for states that I'm sure you're familiar with, ranging from meets requirements to needs improvement or needs significant improvement or intervention. And the second one, and what's notable there is that over the last several years, where determinations were previously only made on the basis of compliance indicators, have now included results for both Part B and Part C in the way we make determinations. Secondly, we have the annual performance report, the SPP APR, which had always included both results and compliance indicators, but we added to that several years ago the State Systemic Improvement Plan, where we asked states to pick one area of result that has specific measurable impact on their students, whether it's increasing graduation rates or reading assessment scores or something along those lines, and to provide a plan on how they're going, a long-term plan on how they're going to improve that. So we are now moving into about almost our second year of implementation. There was the planning stage and the analysis stage, and we're into the implementation stage. And then finally, the third pillar, which took us the longest to develop, is our differentiated monitoring and support system, which we will be focusing on today. As most of you know, prior to 2012, we had used a cyclical monitoring system, mostly compliance-based, and all states got the same type of monitoring as same monitoring visit essentially as any other state would. We have moved into the system of DMS, which now is no longer a one-size-fits-all system, but rather a system where we try to use our resources where we think they are best needed, because we have limited resources, and to differentiate the type of engagement we're having with the states based on their needs. Next slide, please. Okay, so DMS. We are now entering the second year of full implementation of DMS. We started with sort of a truncated version 2 years ago, only for Part B, that started late in April through the end of September. Last year, we implemented it for a full year with both B and C, and this year we're now entering into our second year. As we said, DMS is a key component of RDA, and we use DMS to fulfill our responsibility to monitor our grantees. We want to differentiate the level of support we give based on what the needs of the state are and what we see the risks out there. We also want to make sure that we can address state-specific needs, not just predetermined issues. And as I've mentioned, really allocate its resources the best way we can. We know that resources are scarce for everybody, and we want to make sure we're using them in the best way possible. All right, next slide, please. So the DMS process, we work on a federal fiscal year cycle. So that begins on October 1st through September 30th. Unfortunately, we were a little bit later than we would have liked to have been this year. We had hoped to get out the notices by the end of October. We ended up, for a number of reasons, not being able to get them out till December of 2017, earlier this month for Part B, and just last week for Part C. The notices, which we'll be taking a look at and talking about more, are informed by essentially risk assessments in all the 4 different areas that we look at as part of DMS. And as a result of those risk assessments, what we do is we determine a level of engagement with each state in each DMS area. So the level of engagement can range from universal, which essentially means states can take advantage of all the resources that we have posted on grads or the webinars that we do, the TA calls, things, other types of resources that are available to everyone, to targeted, where we try to address a specific issue with the state that we think needs more attention, to intensive, which is where we need a greater level of attention with that state in that particular area. And as you will see, that engagement will vary from result to result, from area to area. But the important thing is that every state gets a level of engagement in each of the areas that we're going to talk about. All right, next slide, please. So the DMS areas for 2017-18 are compliance, results, the State Systemic Improvement Plan, or the OSEP, and fiscal. Next slide, please. It was largely the same last year, with the exception that last year we had a 5th category that was called a special focus area, and for Part B it was a focus on correctional education, and for Part C, child find. This year we decided to take those areas out of the DMS process. We did not find that it was a good use of our resources at that time, but we are continuing to provide technical assistance in making resources available to states in these areas. So that we're not ignoring it, we're just addressing it through a different mechanism at this point. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, last year was our first full year of implementation of DMS. And because we see this, we see ourselves as a learning organization, and we are through a process of continuous improvement, we wanted to make sure that we made any adjustments to the process as we move forward to try to figure out what kinds of changes we might need to make. We took 2 steps last year. First of all, 2 of our TA centers, NCSI and ECTA, undertook to conduct focus groups for us with states to get their feedback on the process. And then the TA centers summarized those the results of those focus groups and provided those results to us in a report. We also did internal reviews and evaluations within OSEP of the process. And the encouraging thing was that the feedback that we gained from both of those processes was very consistent with each other. There were some things that were focused on more than others in each of them, but to a large extent, they addressed similar areas. So we went ahead and made some of the some changes to DMS for this year based on that feedback, and there's some things that we continue to want to make changes in. One thing was that we had last year, when we talked about what targeted, intensive, targeted, or universal in each area, we called that a designation. And we found that there was a lot of confusion between the term designation and determination. Determinations, as you know, have specific enforcement steps, are something that is required under the statute. And we wanted to make clear that what we're doing through DMS is distinct from the determination process. So because they were both D words and they're similar, it seemed like that was causing a fair amount of confusion. So we have changed to use the term levels of engagement, which signals what we're saying by this. When we're saying that a state is intensive in results, we're not necessarily saying that there's a problem. We're just saying that we believe that there is more attention that should be paid to it by us, and we want to have a more intensive level of engagement with the state over that. We also heard from states particularly that they thought that we rolled out the DMS process in a pretty clear and transparent way, and it was well done to begin with. But as we moved through the process through the year, it was less clear to states about what the next steps were. Communications weren't clear. So we are endeavoring to try to be more consistent in our communications throughout the year and try to make sure we're consistent among states and among our state teams in giving out the same information and be clear for that. We also recognize that particularly in areas like results and OSEP, when we said we were going to provide targeted TA, it was not clear to states and in some cases to OSEP staff exactly what that entailed and what it is that OSEP was offering and what the steps were. So we are actually still in the process of trying to pull together some better resources and options for targeted TA. We're looking at the possibilities of doing groups and cohorts for targeted TA, working with our TA partners more explicitly, as well as our colleagues in the Research to Practice division. So that is an ongoing process that we're working on right now. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the other things we heard from states particularly was that they were finding it challenging to explain to the chief state school officers, or in the Part C world, the lead agency directors, just what was going on with DMS and what it meant when they were told they were targeted or intensive or something else in that area. And they were looking to see if we could provide them with some help in that area. So we thought that was a good point, and we thought that what we could start with is we developed a document called the DMS overview, which is one of the attachments. which was meant to explain DMS at a high level, not going into a lot of details, but just at a very high level, to place it in context and to try to reduce some of the concerns about the levels of engagement. So if we could pull that up right now, Elena, so we can go through that document. It is available on Grads as well as you've got the attachment. Coming up. Okay, great. So this is the document that we came up with. It is in a sort of a question format, as you see. It starts with what is DMS system, gives some basic information on that, talks about how we use it, which is similar to what the information that I just gave you, talks about the areas of the DMS review. We can go down. And talks then about the 3 levels of engagement: universal, targeted, and intensive, and gives some information on what those look like. And then we can go down to the next page. And then we talk about the DMS notices, which we will talk about more shortly. So it mentions that, scroll back up, sorry, mentions that we send the notices, just as we just have, directly to the Part B directors or the Part C coordinators, and that it includes the narrative that explains the DMS process, the level of engagement in each of the areas, the factors that led to the level of engagement, tries to summarize some of the TA that the state is already accessing that might be relevant, and talking about what TA might be proposed from us or engagement might be proposed. Then it talks about what it means if you have 1 or more target or intensive levels of engagement. Again, we are trying to emphasize that it does not mean that there is non-compliance or a huge problem. It means that we think that there is something that merits our attention. It could be something such as the size of the grant that goes to a state, for whether it's California or Texas or New York. The fact that it's a larger grant in and of itself means that if there is a real problem in that state, it's a bigger problem to OSEP, because if the program fails, that's a bigger risk to the department and to OSEP, so we want to pay attention to that. And that's something that most states should be familiar with, because they would do something similar to that, whether it's Illinois paying more attention to Chicago, New York to New York City, etc. And that the idea of the DMS process is designed to mitigate potential risk and allow us to use our resources wisely. It then goes on to talk a little bit about what engagement looks like, that the activities will vary depending on the focus area and the level of engagement, that there will be some collaboration in determining what the specific areas are that we're going to focus on with the states. Intensive fiscal and compliance engagements might include something that might look closer to a traditional compliance monitoring, and that could result in findings of non-compliance. Result in SIP engagements are TA activities designed to help improve the state's capacity. And it's a mixture of on-site and virtual activities, more virtual these days, as we have limited travel funds and we're trying to take advantage of technology, but there are some on-site ones. And then we note that OSEP issues a written report covering any area that received an intensive level of engagement within 120 days of the end of the engagement activity. So if a state was intensive in fiscal, intensive in results, and targeted in SIP and universal in compliance, the written report would mention all of those, but it would only mention the intensive areas. I think I said fiscal, if I remember what I said. So that's what we have been doing. Okay, we can return back to the PowerPoint. And next slide, please. Okay, and in a moment, we're going to pull up the sample DMS notice to give you an idea of what it looks like, what's been sent out. As we mentioned, each notice includes a narrative explaining DMS, lists the level of engagement, lists the factors that led to that level, if it's intensive or targeted, and in some cases may explain that no further engagement is needed, and I will talk about that in a moment. Lena, if you could pull up that other attachment with the sample DMS notice, that'd be great. Okay, so this is, again, a made-up DMS notice for a made-up state of XYZ. You'll see the first page is a narrative that just is giving some basic information about DMS. It's the same for every state. And then if we can scroll down to the second page, that's where it gets to be different. And this is what it looks like. We list each of the areas starting with results. In this case, for XYZ state, the level of engagement, which is right there at the top, for results is universal. And you'll note that under the factor section, we're not listing any factors because we only list factors when the level of engagement is targeted or intensive. To the right of that, we try to summarize what we know about the existing or current engagement that might be relevant to this situation. So in this case, we note that the state is working with the National Technical Assistance Center on transition, and we try to summarize that information that we have. We don't always have full information on this, but we try to give as much as we can. And then underneath that is the new engagement. That is signaling what it is that we expect to be doing at a very broad level with the state at this time. Because this state is universal in results, we're just saying that they can access the information we already have. Then moving down underneath there, you go to the next area in fiscal. Here we get some more substantive information. The level of engagement is intensive, and we list the factors that we looked at that led to this specific level of engagement. There were overdue corrective actions related to fiscal monitoring findings. There was a vacancy in the state director position. As I mentioned, size of the grant award might be a factor. And there was a problem with their state financial support. So all of those led to their level of engagement of intensive. We note to the right that the OSEP has been continuing to make information and technical assistance available, and the state is already working with the Center for IDA fiscal reporting on some related issues. So that's relevant for us to know. As a result, if you go then down to new engagement, we actually say here, no further engagement is required. And we did this in states such as this one for particular reasons. In this case, the state was intensive in the prior year. We conducted the fiscal monitoring that we did with the last year, and we are currently working with the state to help them resolve the findings that we made. And the state's MFS issues, sorry about that, or maintenance of financial support, have already been resolved, and they've worked with the Center for IDA fiscal reporting probably on that. So while we're continuing we are continuing the work we had been doing with the state last year to close down the findings. We're not going to do anything new. So that's what we mean in this case by no further engagement. All right, let's scroll down. We then move on to the compliance area, and in this case, it is also intensive, and we list the specific factors that led to that level of engagement there. Looks like in this case, we're just saying that we've been working with it. We don't know of any specific TA they're receiving that's relevant here. And let's scroll down just a little bit to see the new engagement. And here is a case where we are going to do something new, but we're saying we're going to gather additional information by talking to the state to determine what it is that we're going to do. We're going to talk about the areas that led to the low compliance, figure out what it is that might be helpful to the state, and develop a plan to move them into compliance, which may include some level of monitoring based on protocols in a specific area, or getting them specific TA, or talking about the TA that they're already getting. So that's something that we're currently engaging with that state on in terms of trying to figure out what we're going to do over the next year. And then the final level is the ESEP. Final area is the ESEP. It's a targeted level of engagement. There are a few factors that are listed there. We note that they're already working with the National Center for Systemic Improvement, and we say we're going to provide. Looks like there's a typo. It should say provide the state targeted technical assistance and support. And usually targeted means, as you might gather, less often we would be talking to them. It will be less systemic and more looking at a specific area. But again, it's something that we would work with collaboratively with the state. One thing that should be noted is that our OSEP's engagement that we are recommending in the DMS notices is required if it's targeted or intensive for compliance or fiscal, but it is a voluntary process for OSEP and results, because we don't have the authority to require them to do that when it's an issue of improving results, although we can certainly recommend it and hope that most states will take us up on that. Okay, we can go back to the PowerPoint now and go to the next slide, please. So as we noted, the activities that are conducted under DMS will vary from state to state, depending on the level of engagement in the area. As I just mentioned, fiscal and compliance activities are mandatory. All others are recommended. We are trying much more this year to coordinate any TA activities that we want to conduct with TA centers that are already working with the states or ones that may be most useful with them. And as I've mentioned before, we will provide written responses in all areas with an intensive area of engagement, whether we go on site or it's just a virtual activity. Next slide, please. So the next few slides are just sort of some samples of what the activities might look like. In this case, intensive compliance. One of the factors that led to their intensive level of engagement in this area was their low secondary transition data. So in that case, we would recommend that we conduct a focused review and discussion with the states of the factors that led to that level of engagement, drill down on the data, review the policies and procedures, do a root cause analysis, and issue a letter summarizing the review with findings if noncompliance is identified, but if not noncompliance, what next steps might be recommended. You also might imagine in this case, we might suggest that they be working with the National Center on Secondary Transition or NCSI or somebody else that might also provide additional assistance with that. Okay, next slide. Here's an example if it was targeted for results based on low reading proficiency. We already know that the state is participating in NCSI's Learning Collaborative on Language and Literacy. So rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, we're going to ask the state to report on the activities that they're conducting with the collaborative and what the impact is on improving that performance and help brainstorm what next steps there might be. Okay, next slide. In the fiscal area, we have actually developed some standard protocols for both Part B and Part C that we use to monitor the states that have been identified for intensive in almost all cases. So in this case, it's a Part B state. We have protocols on LEA allocations, that is the funds that are allocated from the state under IDA to the LEAs, and making sure that they're using the right process and formulas for that. And also the subrecipient monitoring protocol on how they're fulfilling their responsibility to do monitoring of the states. And in that process, we'll obviously request documentation from the state, conduct interviews based on the protocols and a review of the documentation, and then issue a letter including findings if noncompliance is identified. All right, next slide. So those are just some examples of different ways we might engage with the state. I mentioned that we made some changes this year. We anticipate some additional changes moving forward. One of the things that we wanted to think about was how we're determining levels of engagement for results and compliance. When we set this up originally, what we have been doing for these two areas is to use the matrices that are already being used from the APR that led to the determinations. We did this originally for a couple of reasons. States were familiar with it. We thought that it would be easy for them to understand what we were doing. Frankly, it was also a readily available source of data for us and one that we didn't have to recreate. But in the review, the focus groups last year and internal reviews, there were questions raised as whether this makes sense, whether it's double dipping, whether it's actually getting to the information we want. And so we wanted to undertake a review to see if there are alternative sources of data that would give us better information to make our levels of engagement. We didn't want to do that in a rushed way, so we have some internal subgroups that have been working on exploring alternatives and reaching out to both states and TA centers for input, and we're hoping to make changes for our next cycle of DMS in the way that we do this. And we may now. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I guess that's the end. I forgot where I was ending. So at this point, I just want to open it up for any questions and comments. Carmen, if you can let me know anything that came through the chat, or if we're going to open up phone lines, however the best way to do this is, I'd be happy to discuss any of this with you.
Yes, well, one of the comments that came in was you sort of addressed first, which is the parent centers are much more familiar with the words of designations rather than levels of engagement. So, you know, had the question been asked in terms of that, in terms of, you know, what do they know about designations that more the parent centers would have known. So this is great that we're doing the webinar because it's a way of sort of saying this is the new language.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to recognize that what we're doing with DMS is very different than the determinations that are issued as part annually based on the statute. As I mentioned, those lead to specific enforcement actions that are required. And DMS, when we talk about a level of engagement, it is not necessarily signaling that there is a problem. It is that we want to engage with the state around these areas and determine if there's a problem or what kind of support is needed. So thank you.
Great. So one of the questions that was asked was, is the DMS letter that goes out to the states a public document that's available on the OSEP website or on the state's websites?
It is not something that we have posted to date. I think if you requested it from the state, they probably would have to give it to you. So if you have questions, I would go to your state at this point.
Okay. Is there will they be public or no?
I think that varies from state to state.
Okay, but there's no intent to make it public on the OSEP website, so they
not that I'm aware of at this time. It's something I can bring back, but I don't know of any intent to do that right now.
Okay, okay. And then there's another question here having to do with the focus groups and conferring with states around this monitoring system. Was there any conferring with intended beneficiaries of early intervention and special education services, such as families of children with disabilities?
No, not this time. I do think that it's an important step for us to think about how to do that in the future. We did not do that at this time because we are engaging specifically with the states, and we wanted to get their feedback about their experiences with the monitoring system, not necessarily with the issues that we were addressing. But I do think that we should think about other ways to engage moving forward. Okay,
great. I think that's all the questions I see right now. I just want to draw attention to folks on the clarification. The proposed rule to delay the significant disproportionality, the notice of proposed rulemaking to delay the significant disproportionality rule is actually not out. What the link that is in there is a link to say that there's an intention of doing that, and there's an OSEP contact if you have any comments or questions about that delay. So you can contact the OSEP contact listed there directly with any comments or questions about the proposal. Okay. Give it a couple more minutes. Doesn't look like there's any other comments.
Well, I wanted to thank everybody for their attention today. I hope you found this useful. If you have additional questions after today, if you want to reach out through Carmen to me, I'd be happy to answer them to the best of my ability. And or you can contact me directly through that email address.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you everyone for all the work that you do every day for children with disabilities. I wish everybody a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year as you continue this work. So thanks everyone, and like I said, we're going to go ahead and eventually get this posted on the CIPRA website. So it will be posted on the parentcenterhub.org website. Thanks again, and thank you, Matt, for your work, and thank you, Elena, for helping us with all the technical difficulties. Take care now. Bye.
Bye-bye.